Okay, so it's about my life in the Soviet Union, about the life of my family, and from every family history you can actually study the history of one's country. So, and my family is not an exception. It reflected several periods in the life of the Soviet Union. And about the life of my family, I decided to widen my personal experience and to make as many connections as possible with the history of my country and with the history of Latvia, where I spent most of my time. Right, now, from the very beginning, I don't know much about the very distant past of my family. It was a very large country with a very turbulent history, as we all know. And not many ordinary Russians, unfortunately, know about their deeper roots, which is a pity, of course. But I was able to trace my family to my great-great-grandparents, who lived in the middle of 19th century. On my father's side, they were all Russians. They lived in Russia. And on my mom's side, they were Tatars. They also lived in the Russian Empire. My dad's great-grandfather was a postmaster, which was quite a high position in the 1880s. And despite his wife coming from a peasant family, he was able to educate his son, Nikolai Yemelyanov, that's him, Nikolai Yemelyanov, who later became a village teacher. The teachers in these schools had, at the most, secondary education in those days and lived in quite poor conditions. Village school teachers earned less than manual laborers, their wages being around 300 rubles a year. They had no other form of income, although they sometimes ran their own small holding, an allotment or beehive, or maybe even some cattle. Very rarely did their job provide housing, and most had to rent a corner in peasants' houses. The work these teachers did was considered almost heroic by society, the fulfillment of a sacred duty to the people. However, moral incentives alone were insufficient. Often teachers, especially those with families, could not cope and switched jobs to civil service accountants or shop workers. Do you want to translate this Russian bit here?
Put me on the spot here. I need to translate from Russian to say. Okay.
Life.
So yeah, the life of most of the intelligentsia obviously motivated them to take the side of.
Didn't motivate.
Oh, didn't motivate. Okay, didn't motivate them to take the side of the capital, of capitalism. The intelligentsia was working intelligentsia. Stolypin, in his declaration to the Tsar in 1904, he actually called the intelligentsia third element.
Village intelligentsia was called the third element.
Yeah. So the main source of radicalism in the villages.
The village where Nikolai Yemelyanov and his wife taught was called Drunken Steppe, and had a railway station, post office, library, medical attendance, surgery, and a chapel. The class struggle was continuing in the countryside after the 1917 revolution, as Nikolai's family house was burned down by kulaks in the early 20s for teaching children from the poor families. It was burned at night, and they escaped just about in time. After that, the family lived in their neighbor's house. They actually rented part of it. And their daughter, Emilia, we can see her here, my grandma, who was born in 1909. In 1925, at the age of 16, left home and went to study at Ural's Medical Institute. Her education became free after 1917, and a lot of people immediately enrolled onto different courses. My grandma was always considered to be a bit of a legendary hero in our family. Soon after her graduation as a sanitary doctor, in the early 30s, she and her first husband went to participate in the building of what became the largest center of world iron and steel production, Magnitogorsk. It's on the southern border with Kazakhstan. Before 1929, it was only a workman's settlement. On this site, you can actually go and see a lot of, this is a picture from, the first picture was from Family Archive, but the other two I got from the site called Katardan. Yes, yes. My grandma arrived there in 1933. From her memories, it was so cold in winter that workers' hands were freezing to metal constructions. People lived in tents, approximately like this one, in fact. In tents heated by iron stoves, several couples lived in one big tent, that's what my grandma told me, and their beds were separated by curtains. However, people didn't mind and enthusiastically built the plant that belonged to them and not to rich magnates or foreign capitalists. That was the prevailing mood. That's what my grandma told me. Emilia worked there as a sanitary inspector. In Magnitogorsk, my grandma, she was 28, decided to become a surgeon, and the family went back to Perm, where grandma specialized as a surgeon. My father Sergei was born there in 1937. After her specialization at the end of the 30s, grandma was sent to work to the Moscow region to practice as a surgeon, where she was caught in the war. In the autumn, this is Kashira near Moscow, not very big hospital. You can see surgical ward, 1940. So she was caught in the war near Moscow, and in the autumn 1941, yeah, she was called to the front line around Moscow as a major of medical service in a divisional first aid post and performed operations in tough conditions. She told us about that time quite little, but that's what she told us. She had performed these operations in a tent under heavy bombardment, often under candlelight with no drugs. She remembered that she sometimes had nothing to give to the wounded but water instead of medicine. She had to say to them that this was medicine, and she had cases when the wounded felt better after that. Grandma didn't spend much time at the front line. She was sent away from the front to work in the base hospital because she had a little son, my dad. This is how in 1942 she found herself with her son in Menzilinsk, a small regional town back in Tatarian Republic, where she was put in charge of the surgical department. That's the surgical department, just next to her house. Local government allocated her a big semi-detached wooden house with a large garden, which belonged to the hospital. This is a later picture. We sort of had only 70s pictures of our house. She had a single neighbor then, a young doctor specializing in dermatology and venereology, who worked at the same hospital. It was Anatoly Glavenko. He's then back. He is on the left-hand side there. It was Anatoly Glavenki, her future second husband, my dad's stepfather, and the only grandfather I ever knew. Granddad Anatoly was trained as a reservist in the 30s, but wasn't called to fight, and we never discussed why. He was Czech by nationality. How his family came to settle in the Soviet Union, I never asked. But I think the Soviet government, being wary of the situation in Czechoslovakia and being uncertain as to where their sympathies may lie, decided not to enlist former Czechoslovakian nationals in the front line. Granddad was a successful doctor. He's in training, second on the right. Granddad was a successful doctor, talented singer, and a great football player. He also was a good communist agitator and a speaker. Later, he entered the Communist Party and became the head of the hospital. My grandma was a quite demanding head of the surgical department. Our friends told us when she was in charge, cleaners even had to wash. Cleaners even had to wash corridor walls and floors every day with chlorine. Their family worked hard, and the Soviet state rewarded them with medals, higher salary, and all sorts of free holidays to the Black Sea spas. Grandma reads her poetry at the 1st of May, gathering in Menzelinsk. This is a 60s picture. This was a popular event. So, the Soviet working people went on many excursions to see their huge country, and these excursions were also free. Unions paid for them. Grandparents had excursions abroad as well. In the early 50s, they visited Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia, and Granddad traveled on a Danube cruise, during which he saw Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Austria. As a family, they also used to go to Moscow often to see new theater plays, ballets, and operas. That's how Soviet people actually spent their holidays. A lot of them. Grandma had a lot of pictures with all her colleagues, sort of being on excursion somewhere, but unfortunately I just couldn't find them. One never hears a good word about life in the Soviet Union from the reactionary Western media. Contrary to what it wants us to believe, Soviet people enjoyed life and all sorts of culture, Western included. Dances that were popular in the 50s were, and that's under Stalin, were waltzes, Charleston, shimmy, Latin American songs like Besame Mucho, and all sorts of jazz. But their favorites were, of course, Soviet singers, like Mark Bernes. He became popular as an actor and singer during the war. Utyosov, Claudia Shulzhenko. Look, hopefully, if Danny's music works, we will be able to hear music at the end of the meeting. People loved their songs so much that everybody knew the words by heart. Songs were about their everyday life. It wasn't patriotic, marches all the time. Many songs were funny, and so many of them were about love. Millions went to the cinemas. It was always very cheap. Apart from Soviet productions, my grandparents watched a lot of foreign films from countries where the British would never have thought in the 50s had their own film industry. Argentinian films, Indian, Egyptian, Finnish, Greek, Yugoslavian, Austrian films were very popular. Films from some bourgeois countries were approached with caution, in my opinion, quite rightly so, and normally reached Soviet viewer a few years later, but nevertheless reached them. In the 1950s, 26 million saw American films like Waterloo Bridge, The Thief of Baghdad, The Great Waltz, His Butler's Sister, Captain Blood, The Sea Hawk, and Tarzan. Soviet women living in cities followed fashion and copied the look of their favorite Soviet actresses. The Soviet light industry wasn't at the forefront of world fashion. There was still a lot to learn, but the Soviet city women were always dressed well. My mom remembers she visited a manicurist and hairdresser once a week in the 60s. There were private seamstresses and masseurs available. It was sort of their private business, and nobody persecuted them for it. There were so-called hipsters in big cities, if anyone can remember what it is. Youngsters wearing yellow narrow trousers, bright ties, and high hairdos. These young people were generally treated with irony, and people used to call them fashion victims. When my dad grew up, he went to study geography, specializing in sea meteorology in Kazan State University. That's more photos of Crimea. That's my dad with his parents on a cruise ship at the Black Sea in 1957. That's post-war childhood. That in 1944-46, everybody was wearing military uniforms, including children, because obviously Russian fighters were so popular. And that's Kazan State University, where he enrolled when he grew up and studied sea meteorology. And he met my mom then at university. Yes, that's my mom and dad after their graduation, traveling to Yalta. They had the full circle of Central Asia, Crimea, Tashkent as well. My mom was studying German language and literature at the same university. The family on my mom's side were Tatar. She doesn't remember much about the family distant past, but told me a little about her mom's. My grandma Zainab, it's Tatarian name, Zainab, was born in 1909, and after her mother's death, lived in an orphanage with her sister Amina. They were so poor in 1915 that they had to go to school in turns, as they had one pair of shoes between the two of them. Later, she was brought up by her aunt. She finished 7 school grades, and after the revolution was able to continue her education at the Workers' Faculty, after which she worked at the newspaper's printing house. She married Kudus Motigulin, my second granddad, who was a chemist at the silicate plant in Kazan. In 1942, he was called to war and was wounded. After successful treatment, Kudus was sent to the Stalingrad front line, and defending Arlovka village, he was killed. It was when Germans didn't get quite to Stalingrad, but were fighting in the outskirts of it, different villages around Stalingrad. In 1944, when my mom went to school in Kazan, it was still during the war, but schools were open and books published. We still keep books of poetry published in those difficult days. It was late 40s, so it was under Stalin, and mom's school was a school for girls. That was interesting because they weren't just mixed schools at that time. There were separate schools for boys and girls sometimes. It was one of the experimental schools that were open under Stalin. Amongst other subjects, all girls were studying Latin language. It's quite rare now, I suppose. Not possible at all. Now, to my memories of the 60s. I was born in Kazan in 1962. My 25-year-old parents, in the beginning, lived with my mom's mom in an apartment in the very center of the city, near the opera theater. Picture of Kazan. No, sure. That's Kazan, 1960s. It was a house. Well, I'm going to give you some details about the housing Soviets had, because I know that everybody sort of think, probably quite rightly so, that it was quite a big problem in the Soviet Union at a certain time. And the Soviet government tried to solve it, obviously, in different ways. But when they were young, my parents lived with my mom's mom in an apartment in the very center of the city near the opera theater. It was a house with so-called corridor system. There were several family rooms, each with running water, located along the corridor, but everyone shared a large kitchen. It maybe sounds bad to the British ear, but it was actually quite a good place to socialize. Kitchens usually became centers of, sort of little community centers where people like to socialize, especially ladies. The family worked, so I had a nanny. When I asked my mom about the difference between Stalin's and Khrushchev's time, she said that with Khrushchev's coming, food shortages began. As mom remembers, there was little food in the shops. Early in the morning before going to work, mom went to the shop to buy milk for me. But everything was available at the market. People were buying butter, milk, chicken, and meat there. Somebody once commented on this, saying that though the shops were empty, people's fridges were nevertheless full. And it is true. When you come to visit somebody, in the Soviet Union, the fridges were always full. It's nice stuff. Generally, people tended to eat less anyway, not because there was nothing to eat. I think in this country in the 50s, people also were modest in their ration. Our dinner plates were the size of a dessert plate, not as big as these days, isn't it? That was 50s in Britain as well, I think. Smaller plates. Right. In the summer, it was popular to make your own jams and pickles. Russians were always good at it, at making jams, pickles, and to store for winter. Throughout my childhood, every summer, I visited my grandparents in Mendelinsk. The school holidays were long, 3 months, and this was the happiest time of my life. My parents also remember these summers with great affection. Grandma took her holiday at the same time and spent a lot of time with us. I don't know how she had time for everything, but she also took care of a large garden, which had lots of flowers and a large special garden for raspberries. In the 1964, the first cooperative apartments started to be built in 1964 in the country, and many city families, instead of waiting before they get a free state apartment, which could take some time, decided to improve their housing that way. And why not? In 1962, there was a money reform, and you can translate this.
For all their deposits into Sberbank, which was the central bank, citizens received 10 new rubles for 1 old ruble. Cash was exchanged with no limitations using the same ratio. The prices in government shops were slashed by 10 times.
Yes, and I personally think that probably this was one of the reasons why some shops stayed, not very well stocked. It's simply because the food prices went down at that time. In 1963, Dad's parents gave my dad 300 rubles, and that was the deposit for the new cooperative bedstead where my family moved in 1964. It was quite a small place, but we had our own facilities. In each apartment had an individual gas boiler to heat up the water. The price of the apartment wasn't high for an ordinary person at all. So in 10 years' time, in 1974, my grandma, living there alone and being a pensioner, because my family lived in Latvia by then, was able to pay off the purchase price. In 10 years' time, the cooperative apartment was paid off completely. Bills were a couple of rubles a month. With her pension, 60 rubles per month. That was the pension after the reform, 60 rubles per month. We had a few modern 60s style furniture items in the apartment, as well as old grandma's chest of drawers and an old carved wardrobe. Very old one. Mom loved her new radiola. That's the name for a radio and a record player in one. We had a number of records with all sorts of modern popular music. I remember Mom putting it on. It was boogie woogie, tangos, foxtrot, twist, rumba, Hungarian jazz, Robertino Loretti, Cuban dances, songs from the international music festivals. We had it all. People probably will remember Pat Boone. My husband could remember it. Ima Sumac, Mexican singer. Tommy Steele. They were all popular. We didn't have every new pop song, but we had enough to enjoy ourselves. The West always emphasizes the fact that Beatles music was treated with suspicion, and their records never reached Soviet audience. As usual, when Western media can't tell the truth, they tell half-truth. Beatles music did reach the Soviet listener in 1967. Is it late or early? 1967, quite early, I think, isn't it? It was the song The Girl. That was the first song that reached Soviet listener then. After that, their records appeared very regularly, I can tell you. What Soviet state did is to criticizing brainless fans who weren't interested in anything else in life but listening to pop music and acting stupidly at pop concerts. That's all, basically. But we did have Beatles music and we enjoyed it as well. When I was 2, I had to go to the nursery. They were free, and at the age of 4, I went to kindergarten. They were also free, of course. Soviet state had sensible, educated, and healthy approach in bringing up its new generation. I enjoyed my time in the kindergarten very much. In the summer, the whole lot of children were sent for a month to dachas, like summer houses in the green outskirts of the town. We spent a lot of time outdoors, as this was what doctors recommended. Sundays were parents' days. Parents would arrive in buses and bring some delicatessen to us, like homemade pies and sweets, and Sundays were noisy and fun. I started school in Kazan at the age of 7. 1st of September each year was the first school day, and it was a big happy event at schools across the whole country. Our uniform was different in each republic of the Soviet Union. In Russian Federation, it was brown dress with white lace collar and a black apron for girls, but on the 1st of September, girls were wearing a white apron and white ribbons in their hair. Every school child had to bring flowers to their teachers. We didn't have lessons on that day, but just informal meetings with our old and new friends and teachers. During their first year at school, all children joined little octobrists. Dan, can you translate this, please?
The first groups of little Octobrists appeared in 1923-24 in Moscow, alongside pioneer groups. They accepted children
of the same age
as the revolution, so 1917. So this is where the name comes from, Oktyabrята, little Octobrists.
It was a symbolic ceremony when our older friends pioneers pinned a little red star with Lenin as a child on it to our chest. We were little Octobrists from the age of 7 up to the age of 11, and to be a little Octobrist meant to be more responsible for your behavior, generally, and actions, really, and your studies. It meant that one had to try harder at school. There was little ideology and more common sense to it, to be honest. At the age of 11, everyone became a pioneer. Again, there was a special ceremony attached to the event. All the comrades tied our silk neckties, and there was Pioneer School wind orchestra playing. It didn't happen very often, but sometimes, if the candidate grossly misbehaved or was getting very bad, really bad marks at school, their ceremony would be delayed until there was some improvement in behavior. Some of the pioneers had some duties attached to their status. They had to help to organize younger children's social events and help those who were falling behind at their studies. It was a big responsibility and taught us a lot. I remember organizing with my friends a class library for 7-year-olds. At the age of 14, everybody was entering a Komsomol organization in which they had to stay up to the age of 28. Our life was socially much more interesting and better organized than the life of today's Russian children. One can read about Komsomol on Wikipedia. I think it's quite a good article there. 1970s now. After I finished my first year at Kazan school, my father was offered a job in Baltic Fleet. So before that, we lived in Kazan, and now my family sort of moving to Latvia. So he was offered a job in Baltic Fleet as a sea meteorologist. In those days, even every medium-sized fishing boat had to have one on it, so the weather forecast would be more precise. Now, however, Latvian largely reduced fishing fleet, and they haven't got their own meteorologists on them, and they have to rely on forecasts coming from the European shores, which makes life on the boat obviously more dangerous. Sorry. So parents accepted the offer, but they had to find their own place to live. They exchanged my grandmother's old apartment on Theatre Street for a large room in a so-called communal apartment in Riga, while my grandma moved into mom's cooperative apartment in Kazan. Coming to Riga was a new, unknown experience for us all, sometimes not easy. The house we lived in was a 3-floor, 19th century one. In bourgeois times, each apartment was occupied by one wealthier family. When Latvia became Soviet before the war, the government had done what could be done really to house people who came from Latvian villages destroyed by the war, and people who worked for a new developed Latvia in new factories. So houses which were left empty in the 1940s by immigrating families were given to others. Because there were not enough separate and new apartments to meet the growing population of Riga, sometimes families occupied one room. Here has to be said, these weren't small rooms, and because this sort of accommodation was located in old houses, ceilings were high and windows large. There also was a quota that had to be met when a family lived together in one room. It was different in different republics, depending on its housing situation. We lived in one 20 square meters room with shared kitchen and toilet facilities with other 2 neighbors. There was no central heating in the rooms, but we had a tall ceramic stove in the room. Dad or Mom burned firewood in it each day after work, and the room was never cold. We had no hot water, and to wash the laundry, Dad had to heat a stove in the bathroom. We couldn't use our washing machine. You must remember it too. In those days, washing machines did not heat water. In the weekend, our family went to the communal bathhouse down the road, which had 2 separate units for women with little kids and men. We could spend a few hours there, warming up in the steam room, or just sitting on hot granite benches, washing and chatting. Every apartment in the house had an allotment. When I turned 17, our grandparents once again helped us with money, and parents bought a cooperative 2-bedroom apartment. Then in the seventh-story new house built for people working for the Academy of Science. So each big place like Academy of Science or big factory, they also run their sort of housing cooperatives, building houses for their workers. Dad had quite good salary as he had to go to sea for 6 months a year, and Mom found a new job related to her specialism in one of the Academy of Science institutes. The institute was called the Institute of Wood Chemistry. 15 institutes of scientific research that were under the wing of the Academy of Science became the most important research center built after the war under Stalin's rule. That's a typical example of Stalin's architecture. And that was really the Latvian pride, Latvian Academy of Science, which virtually non-existent now. Now scientific activity in Latvia heavily relies on occasional European grants, but then the Latvian Academy of Science was one of the most active and prestigious in the Soviet Union. Mom was doing translation and interpreting work for them. If in Kazan, which was Russian Federation, she could use her native Russian language, in Riga, Mom soon had to learn Latvian to fit into the scientific community. Mom had a happy working life, and there were all sorts of social activities organized for people at work. Sometimes the intelligentsia was sent to help with harvesting and collective farms. It was a sort of duty, but it was also work in the fresh air, and at the end of the day, you could take some of the produce with you for free. The institute where Mom worked also had its own jazz club. Mom was told she was a talented drummer. Integration, now a little bit about integration of Russians into Latvian life and culture. There are a lot of speculations about this sort of topic because, Latvia became Soviet later, after majority of the republics became Soviet, and there were some tensions perhaps in the beginning. I don't remember them. I lived in Latvia in the 70s and 80s, and I don't remember any sort of big conflicts or tensions between Russians and Latvians. Integration of Russians into Latvian life was encouraged. So Mom enrolled me to a nearby school, which had classes for Latvian and Russian children. In my school, kids studied in a mixed environment up to the age of 10, after which they were free to choose the language of their further education and whether to stay at that school and study in Latvian or to move to another. So there was a choice actually given to people, even to Russian families, whether their kids want to study in Latvian or continue the education in Russian. There was the same teacher teaching all subjects in the first years of study. I still remember my first teacher who encouraged my love of drawing and reading. And my favorite place at school was the library. Each area of town also had libraries, specially built for children, filled with best children's literature on both languages and foreign classics translated into Russian and Latvian. My library I joined was mixed. It had literature in Latvian and in Russian as well. At the age of 9, after watching Franco-Italian film, The Three Musketeers, in a cinema, I couldn't wait until the book was returned to the library by the previous reader. After reading it, I organized my friends to play Three Musketeers at school breaks. We had heroes' names, washed our imaginary horses, fenced with twigs at the schoolyard, and exchanged secret king's reports. I was growing in a most friendly and cultured place. When I was a teenager, with my friends, we visited all the town historical sites. Medieval time interested me most, and I wanted to become an archaeologist. Therefore, I enrolled into the Archaeological Society for children. where we were invited to see conservation rooms in the Museum of Foreign Arts and were taken to excavation sites. Apart from that, I continued my gymnastics in the Central Pioneer Palace. This is at present it's a presidential palace. It's not Pioneer Palace anymore, unfortunately. That was great place. And it had all sorts of activities for children, including even astronomy circle. There was no need to pay for any of these things at all. Now it is a presidential palace again, but there is no funding for what children of Soviet Latvia enjoyed on such a scale. There are only separate children activities scattered here and there, and obviously families need to pay for it all. The children's library in the quiet streets near our home was also closed, obviously, and now there is a Chinese embassy. In the early days of capitalism of the 90s, there were rumors that all Russian books were taken away from it and burned. There was actually an article in one of the newspapers, Russian newspapers, telling the story. I finished school in 1979 with not very good marks in anything apart from literature and history, because I was good in art as well. It was decided that I probably should try and take exams at the Latvian Academy of Arts. That's the Latvian Academy of Arts. It used to be a Jewish economic school in bourgeois Latvia. After taking their last exams at school in May, Soviet school students aspiring to go into higher education had to take summer entrance exams in the institute of their choice. So it was two sets of exams. They had exams at school and then entrance exams into university, which was quite difficult to do in one summer. They were very difficult exams. There was a lot of competition, anything up to 30 people competing for one place. That's how higher education was actually popular, was very popular. Selection of candidates at Latvian State University and Medical Institute was even more rigorous. As we found out, there were not many chances for me to get through the entrance exams because preference was actually given to children previously attending the Academy's specialist art school. And here started my long road to becoming a sort of professional artist. A little bit about intelligentsia in Latvia. They all complain now that they live so bad, that Latvian state doesn't support them. But in those days in the Soviet Union, intelligentsia was supported very much. They all had good high salaries. In order to prepare me for future entrance exams, Dad found a Russian tutor who taught at the Decorative Art College and led a drawing studio in the old part of Riga in his spare time. Later, I had to learn that there were so-called nationalist or local artistic schools or trends. That probably will be quite interesting for you to know. Not many people know that. In every Soviet republic, there are special nationalist trends in art, in painting, in music, in film. These trends formed in every republic over the years, sometimes centuries, and Soviet government kept and encouraged them in local literature, painting, theater, and music. The assertion that Soviet regime destroyed national culture is quite simply a lie. This is a lie. Latvian culture was respected by the Soviet government. There were Latvian theaters, there were Latvian theaters, 2 youth theaters, numerous folk choirs, folk dance studios. Latvia, like other republics of the former Soviet Union, had her own film studios, which produced 10 films a year, and a lot of documentaries. Latvian films were popular all over Soviet Union, especially Latvian comedies. Latvian actors were loved by all Soviet people. Many Latvian actors, musicians, ballet dancers made a good career in famous Moscow theaters. They were Latvian writers and Latvian artists' unions, supported and financed by the state. Artists and musicians' works were commissioned and well paid. Exhibitions, some of them experimental, like installations, organized, and there was no question on who pays for it all. The state footed the bill, and artistic community, indeed, took it for granted. There was also one Russian drama theatre in Riga. Russian books were also published, but not on such a scale as Latvian ones. I know from my own experience that the situation regarding national culture was the same in every national republic of the former Soviet Union. Even, this is very interesting, I think. Well, looking back at it, I find it quite interesting to myself. Even in pop music, every republic had many singers and musicians continuing national tradition in their works, even in pop music. The most popular of the singers being those who sang in their native language, not in Russian. All of the Soviet Union could hear them on their radio channels and often see them on their television screens. So, living in Latvia, we would be very familiar with culture in other republics. We knew Uzbek, Georgian, Ukrainian, Azerbaijani, Belarusian writers and poets. Their songs and artists were familiar to us. In Latvia, Russian children were made to study Latvian language and literature at school. I studied it as well. It is a different question whether these lessons were poor or good, but we were given the opportunity to learn about the culture of the republic we were living in. Mixed marriages were common. People got on together. Although children used to prefer to mix with their own language group, there were a lot of personal friendships. My best friend is Latvian. My mom's Latvian neighbor was evacuated with her aunt to Siberia before the war in 1939. She came back in the early 80s, having enjoyed a high standard of living in Siberia, own apartments, high education, and worked with my mom in the institute. Now she often shares her complaints about her living standards in today's Latvia and the treatment she receives from the bourgeois Latvian government. In culture, the emphasis was being put on supporting a national tradition. However, this situation could present some difficulties for people from other republics who wanted to study art or music in a neighboring republic. There were all sorts of artificial obstacles local national intellectuals created to bar people of other nationalities to enter Republican art academies or conservatoires, unless they soaked in local way to paint or adjusted their drawing or adjusted their style. So, for example, my Russian teacher was using methods of the Russian drawing school, and as time went on, it made my attempts to enter Latvian art academy quite difficult. Strictly speaking, however absurd it sounds now, one had to draw and paint the quite specific Latvian way for the entrance exams, or one could never be accepted. Yes. After the exams results were published, one would normally see that out of 15 successful candidates for the, say, the painting course, there would be only 1 or 2 Russian names. Also, some Latvian people attending Russian studio, found it impossible to enter the academy because their style obviously changed. It wasn't Latvian enough anymore. By the end of the 80s, Baltic national governments, we all know that, started negotiating their way out of the Soviet Union. In their moves towards independence, the Latvian government expected sympathetic response from Moscow, and to deserve such a response, cultural institutions relaxed entrance process for Russian undergraduates. To my surprise, in 1986 I found my name on the list among those accepted to study at the academy. Our course was the last one that students did not have to pay for. 6 years art course was completely free through thorough teaching, books, art materials, everything. After 1990, higher education in Latvia ceased to be completely free. Now it's completely, you have to pay the fees. Close to the end of the talk. At the age of 17, while trying to get to the academy, I started working. My dad found my first job for me. He wanted me to do something in art, so when he called the HR of the big factory in Riga, he was told they needed a designer to help with some Komsomol events. They were prepared to trust a young artist to try her hand at work. I found myself in the heart of one of the biggest Komsomol organizations in Riga, at the famous state electrical engineering plant. VEF, it's called VEF in Latvian abbreviation. Latvian life there was in full swing. VEF used to be a relatively small factory before the war, producing telephone stations during bourgeois times. In 1944, during evacuation, Germans transported major parts of technological equipment and documentation to Germany, and they destroyed what they couldn't take with them. In 1946, the first radio receiver, which made the factory famous all over Soviet Union. It was produced, and the plant has grown rapidly during the 60s. It became the largest production unit in Soviet Latvia. It specialized in the manufacture of telephones and transistor radios, which were highly coveted throughout the USSR and were exported to 46 countries around the world. My work for the Factory Komsomol Committee included designing pennants, leaflets, and badges. With other artists, we designed backdrops for big events and disco nights. So Komsomol organized disco nights as well, obviously. I simply can't miss the opportunity to tell you how working people were treated by the factory bosses and workers' unions, as I saw it with my own eyes. The factory looked like a city to me. It had its own electrotechnical college, where one could go and continue education after 8th grade school at the age of 15, and later on join a friendly working family. VEF had its own palace of culture, where there were 22 different music, drama, art, and folk art studios. VEF had its own sport club with numerous sections and swimming pool. VEF workers were treated in their own hospital and polyclinics, free of charge, of course. VEF had its own spa center on the beaches of Baltic Bay, camping site on the river, and VEF workers' children spent their summer holidays in their own pioneer camps or in their own kindergarten while their parents were working. They printed their own newspaper on 2 languages. The factory had country's famous food service center, where one could not only have tasty dinner, but visit several cafes, Swedish table, or even a bar. The price of a set dinner was 60 kopecks. Anyone could afford to eat there every day. Housewives could buy ready-made meals in the factory shops. The factory unions sent workers on organized trips abroad. In 1982, I visited GDR, German Democratic Republic. I work for my factory works for me, was workers' popular slogan in those days. Komsomol Committee took active part in organizing our workers' social life, competitions, trips, and youth activities. I think it was not only me who felt a friendly atmosphere around them. We all had a feeling of support. On a bigger scale, we felt that not only a factory, but the whole country belonged to us. It was generally a feeling of community, a feeling of It was generally a feeling of community in difficult times as well as easy ones. And it is important to say that the workers weren't worried about their future and professional perspectives at all. It was all guaranteed for them. At the end of the 80s, Soviet states invested millions of rubles, to buy new modern equipment for WEF factory. WEF was preparing to produce for 21st century. This equipment practically wasn't used. It was sold for metal scrap prices. New owners of WEF buildings don't need new technologies. Only 200 people work in what is left from once famous electrotechnical plant, which employed 20,000 people. The rest of the huge historical buildings are sold for amusement center and shopping malls, and Latvian government prefers to tell us tales about horrors of Soviet occupation. 1990s is a what happened to that? That's what it is now. Apart from luxurious shopping mall and whatever it is, the amusement center, the rest of it is looks like this. 1990s is a completely different story. Latvia has got her independence in 1990, and everything in the country has changed rapidly. There are a lot of materials published in English about that period, but all of them are quite reactionary and unfriendly to working class. The most honest and truthful account I found only in 2 books. The best one is Harpal Brar's Perestroika, a complete collapse of revisionism, in which he foresaw the results of the restoration of capitalism in Russia. I would urge you to read it. And the other one is written by 2 Americans who hadn't been to Russia when the above-mentioned events developed, but who gave the most honest and truthful picture. It's called Socialism Betrayed, by Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny. That's it.
Thank you, Julia, for that amazing presentation.
Thank you very much for listening to it.
When I first met Julia, she told me that she hadn't really become politicised until she left the Soviet Union. I think after listening to that, you can see the groundwork for a political understanding that was laid at a very, very early age. And also, you know, the lies that are told in this country about the Soviet Union, about it being a grey state full of grey people living dull grey lives. This shows the colour and vibrancy that was the Soviet Union. Even at the end, in the revisionist period, it was full of colour, vibrancy, and people wanting to do good. You know, there was nothing grey about the Soviet Union.